everyone, welcome back once again. We're shifting gears, no more grunge, no more Sufjan Stevens, no more Ween. Instead, we're going to talk about an artist who is one of my all-time favorites, and who is going to have a new album out very soon. The one, the only, the incomparable. Take it away, boys! Thank you, Flo and Eddie. Anyway, chronologically, the most recent Alice album I reviewed before skipping over to Killer was Easy Action. Now, at the end of 1970, the Alice Cooper group were not in a terribly good place. You know, they had done the Frank Zappa thing, they'd been in LA for a couple years, and it just hadn't worked out. They had a contract with Straight Records, that's true, but those records, those first two albums, they didn't do well, they didn't win them anything other than a cult following, and they were starving out in LA, so they went to Detroit, where at the time there was a thriving garage rock scene centered around bands like The Stooges and MC5. You know, it was a really interesting stuff. Weirdly enough, a lot of like glam came out of that sort of whole scene. Not so much the bands themselves, although Iggy Pop did do some glam stuff in the 70s. But a lot of the glam types said, "Oh yeah, I love that stuff," which is really weird because you don't hear much of that in glam aside from like the really basic riffage in their sort of glammed up artifice rock, what have you. And it was in Detroit that the band ran across, through a convoluted series of exchanges that I'm not going to discuss here, a young Canadian producer by the name of Bob Ezrin, who eventually took them under his wing. He was very young, and they were his first major production gig. And over the course of a few months of endless rehearsal and hard work, Ezrin eventually worked the Alice Cooper group into a lean, mean, hard rock group with a theatrical edge, pioneering a style that would eventually come to be known as glam, when Limeys seized upon it, bent it to their own whims, and it was, as things usually happen, massively bigger over there than it ever was over here. The band's first single with Ezrin, I'm 18, was a success, and it paved the way for them to record an album together. Their third album overall, their first on Warner Brothers, and their last with Straight Records. Love it to death. What an album. An absolute classic, one of the very best Alice Cooper albums. Not my favorite by any means, but top 5 definitely. I don't have a source in front of me, but I remember reading somewhere that when Warner Brothers bought out Straight Records, when Straight Records went under, because Zappa lost interest, he moved on to Discreet, and Herb Cohen wasn't really going to do anything with it either. I remember reading that Warner's only bought, I think, 2 albums out of the entire catalog, and those albums were Trout Mask Replica by Captain Beefheart and Love It to Death. So that, you know, that's illustrious company right there, at least to someone like me. Maybe not to an average Alice Cooper fan, I don't know. So anyway, let's get into this amazing album. So things open up with Caught in a Dream. It's a fantastic album opener. It's kind of laid back musically, but Alice's delivery is suitably intense. And I love those subdued organs buried in the background of the choruses. This is one of the first Alice Cooper tracks I ever heard. I've always loved the lyrics to this track. It tackles teenage angst with a real satirical, sardonic edge. And musically, there's a lot of hints of old 60s, almost Pretties for You Coop on here, especially those harmonicas, which disappeared from the Alice Cooper group's musical vernacular pretty quickly after this album. I like this a lot too. It's not as memorable as those first 2 tracks, but the bass bits are really awesome, and it's a fun deep cut. Black Juju is great also. It's very early Alice, much more so than I remembered it, because the last time I listened to this album was a while ago, longer ago than it should have been, and I remembered this as being a little more, you know, standard jammy rock thing, kind of like The Doors, where they just do the same thing for 8 minutes. That's not really what this is at all. It's more like the psychedelic freakouts on Easy Action, although it's not as psychedelic. It's more dark and swirling and vaguely mystical. And this is the inevitable early 70s rock song about groupies. Everybody had to have one. Pink Floyd had one. King Crimson had one. And if King Crimson are writing songs about groupies, you know everybody else is doing it. There's also the aforementioned thing with Zappa that I played that little snippet of in the intro, where Zappa was sort of integrating mentioning of Alice Cooper into his live show during this period. Zappa in 1971 was all about groupies, like he was doing whole stage shows about groupies, but this is not a Frank Zappa video, this is an Alice Cooper video. Hallowed Be Thy Name is phenomenal. This is one of the first appearances of what would eventually become the sort of the default Alice Cooper. You know, the creepy spook show Alice, you know, Halloween stuff, you know, but during this era, it was just a part of the package. Full guitar, really obvious Doors influence. I mentioned that on Black Juju, but it's definitely here as well. This is more great, creepy stuff, apparently making fun of the Beatles. I never realized that. You wouldn't know it from the lyrics. I guess they were, the Long and Winding Road was coming out and people were really praising it and the band didn't think it was that good. Ah yes, the Ballad of Dwight Fry. This is the best song on the album to me. This is the stone cold classic. Really points the way forward, not only to some of the longer stuff on Killer, but to, again, the whole sort of spook show, Welcome to My Nightmare, Halloween Party, Alice Cooper, that we've gotten pretty much ever since 1975, discounting his whole high on crack period in the early 80s. It doesn't change that much musically, but it flows together with the previous track and the next track, and almost forms like a little 3-song triad. Lyrically, it's about a mental patient. It's about a character who has been institutionalized, and there's some really great character bits. Alice does some great voices. Like I was saying with Glam, a lot of people have borrowed a lot from this album, and this track in particular. And I have to say, it's the highlight of the album. In fact, I have a memory somewhere from my teenage years of riding in a car with a friend of mine and his dad, and I don't remember how this came up, but the radio was playing this track, and the dad was like, yeah, this is the real Alice Cooper. School's out, you know, No More Mr. Nice Guy, those tracks, get rid of them. Get rid of them. This is the real Alice Cooper. And I don't fully agree with that, but I definitely get where he was coming from. So the album ends with a cover of a track by Rolf Harris, Australian singer-songwriter, Kate Bush collaborator, and okay, so we're gonna pretend that Alice Cooper and Dennis Dunaway wrote this track and never mention any of this again. I didn't used to like this. I used to think this wasn't a good way to end the album, but honestly, I think it fits thematically. It works with the album. You know, the sun's coming up, you're at the end of the long nightmare. It almost does the thematic thing from side 2 of Welcome to My Nightmare, but it does it earlier and more subtly. So I think I like it better, actually. What can I say? Love It to Death is an absolute masterpiece. The first truly definitive Alice Cooper album, and just one of the great records of the 70s. You know, I love those first 2 albums, but they're not everybody's cup of tea, and there are better psychedelic albums. But this is one of the best glam albums, one of the best hard rock albums, one of the best garagey kind of albums I've ever heard. And I think that garaginess is what kind of pushes it and Killer ahead of the rest of the stuff the Alice Cooper group did. Because School's Out and Billion Dollar Babies are really, really good, but they're very glam. They're very Hollywood. Whereas this and Killer less so, this one especially, have that raw, garagey Detroit edge that the band went up there in the first place to get. In a way, it's the purest distillation of what the Alice Cooper Group was. Even though, if I was going to recommend an album of theirs to anybody, I would probably say Billion Dollar Babies, because I think that's the quintessential album. It's also the one I heard first, so, you know, bias. But this is definitely one of their best. There's not a bad song on here. Black Juju is not for everybody. It's got that weird psychedelic quality that's not for everybody, but it's one part of the album, and everything else is good enough to justify coming back again and again and again. This is a 5 out of 5, 10 out of 10, depending on the day. Other days it's a 9. But it's a very, very good album, and one that I cannot recommend to you highly enough. And I assume this is kind of what the new Alice is trying to get back to, although some of the participants kind of have me spooked a little bit, but that's a topic for my next review. So until then, I will see you guys later.